Good morning, Mr. Schoenfeld.
Morning.
My name is Nancy Fisher, and I am here in your home in New York City to interview you for the USC Shoah Foundation archive. Today's date is August 7th, 2023. The language of this interview is English. My name is Nancy Fisher. Today's date is Monday, August 7th, 2023. I'm here in the New York City apartment of Mr. Fred Schoenfeld, Holocaust survivor, to conduct the interview for the USC Shoah Foundation. The language of this interview is English. Good morning.
Good morning.
Please tell me your name, as you were called at birth, and spell it for me.
Well, my legal name is Alfred Schoenfeld, but my name is Fred Schoenfeld, Schoenfeld.
And were you known at any time in your life by a nickname?
No, just Freddie.
Please tell me when you were born.
I was born on March 9th, 1936.
And where were you born?
I was born in the town of Košice, which at that time was in Czechoslovakia.
Would you please spell the name of the town?
Kosice.
And what year were you born?
1936.
And what is your age today?
87.
Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up, I was born in town Košice, but in 1939, when there was, they realigned the countries and the Czechoslovakia was no longer as Czechoslovakia. Slovakia split away from the Czech Republic. And since my father's business was mainly in Slovakia, we moved across the border to Slovakia, and we lived in a town called Prešov, P-R-S-O-V, and that's where we lived after 1939.
You just mentioned your father. Allow me to ask some questions about your family. What was your father's name?
My father's name was Simon.
Can you tell me about him?
Well, he was a great father. He was a good businessman, very devoted to our family. He was a pillar in the community. He was very active in the community. And that's what I remember.
When you say active in the community, are you talking about Prešov?
Yes, in Prešov, yes, in the Jewish community, all the various organizations, and especially after the rise of anti-Semitism, it was very important to belong to certain, to help out people and stuff like that.
What organizations are you talking about?
I really don't have any names of the organizations, but I assume they were social organizations and centered as in all the European cities in those days. There was a community, the Jewish community, which later became in charge of they used to make up the lists for the deportations. It was a lot of going on there, and I remember him coming home very aggravated and stuff like that.
What did your father look like?
What did he look like? Well, I can show you a picture.
We could see that later.
Okay. Nice looking man. And, in those days, a little bit, today you would call him slightly overweight, very, as you know, the Jewish men, heads of families, they would always eat well. And he He was a very, very sharp dresser, always dressed properly. He was brought up, he was strictly Orthodox, religious. However, that didn't stop him from going to opera and concerts. And he was, I would call him a worldly man, in living in a very, what you may call a very old-fashioned little town.
Where was the opera available?
The opera that's available was after the war when we moved back to Košice. There's a huge national opera theater, and in the center of town, and that's where I used to go to the opera.
So that's post-war.
Post-war.
Tell me about your mother.
My mother was a typical Jewish mother, a great housekeeper, great cook, and took care of the house very. And because my father, as I would certainly call him, a devoted husband, but when he came home, dinner had to be on the table when he came home, and that's a typical description. Today you would call him sort of chauvinistic, but that's the way it used to be in those days.
What was your mother's name?
Eleanor.
And before she married, what was her maiden name?
Baum.
Where was your father born?
My father was born in Bardejov.
And your mother?
My mother was born in a very, very small village near the Polish border called Lubotin.
Did you ever learn from them how they met?
Unfortunately, I have no idea. I have no idea how they met.
And were there any siblings in the house?
On my mother's side,
What, did you have brothers or sisters in the house?
my
Did you grow up with
no.
brothers or
I was the only child till 1946, after the war, when my sister was born.
So who were the other adults, that were in your life at the early age in Prešov that you would remember?
My father was related to a family called Schöndorf in Bardejov. It was slightly related to them. It was the father who head of the patriarch of that family, who happened to have been my godfather. There were five brothers, and they sort of they were very influential in the town of Bardejov. They owned the general store, they owned the gas station, they owned the mill, so they were big businessmen. And my father was very, very close to them, and they always used to. It was like sort of part of my family. And then we had all kinds of friends. I mean, it was a long time ago. I don't remember too much.
Oh, I'm looking for the memories that adults in your world would have given you, like aunts and uncles and
my
grandparents.
Unfortunately, I lost my father's father, my grandfather. He went to Auschwitz, and my mother's family, most of them survived. They were in Belgium, so I never had any personal contact with them. Well, I was till later on in life, but my house was always open. People would come from little towns, and always people eating in our house. There were when they came into town. We used to have a market every Monday and Thursday, so the people from the other towns would come in. They would always stop off at our house. They knew that they would always get a meal or something. And there were always people, this was before television and all that stuff. Every night in my house, there were people socializing, discussing politics, discussing what to do next. and so there were always lots of people in my house.
What about any Jewish observance going on in your house?
We were strictly Orthodox, as most of the people in my town. Nobody. I went to Hebrew school, went to synagogue, and on Sabbath was holy. Nothing's happening. And what I remember mostly about Shabbat was that after lunch, my father would take his nap, and when he got up from the nap, it was showtime. I had to show him everything that I learned in Cheder, in Hebrew school for the previous week. As long as I did my stuff, as long as it was satisfactory, everything was great. But if I didn't do so well, I heard about it.
If somebody's watching, your interview in the future and doesn't understand what Cheder was, would you explain?
Okay, Cheder is what you would call today Hebrew school after regular school, and especially when Cheder I'm speaking about after the war, when I was 9 years old, there weren't that many kids. There weren't that many kids left survived. So we had a whole group of kids, various ages, and the rabbi was a tough-looking guy who used to have a stick in his hand, and he would bang the stick, and you would have to obey and listen to what he's got to say. As a matter of fact, if you misbehaved, he would call you up and he would tell you to put your fingers like this, and then he would take his stick and slam it, which hurt. When I told this to my father came marching into the school, and he said to the teacher, the rabbi, "Listen, when my son does something that you don't like, you call me, and I will take care of it. Don't you ever lay a hand on him." But that was you used to be scared of your teacher, but that's what you did, and that's the way Cheder was.
You spoke of going to regular school in the morning, and
yes.
So, tell me, was Hebrew school part of the family expectation, or was that the way it was in schooling for Jewish children? They went to public school in the morning and then had instruction.
The way it used to be was that there was the ultra-Orthodox went to yeshivas, and they stayed. That's all they learned. But I guess you could call it, we were sort of secular, and that's the way it was. So we went to regular school before, and afterwards, all day Sunday and after school.
So how old are you when you're talking? How old were you in these years that you're talking about before the war?
Before the war, well, let's say in what I remember in 1942. So I was in 1942. So I was 6 years old. I was in the first grade, and when I went to the first grade before the war, was where I experienced a lot of trauma, because one day you walk into school, and the teacher, you're heading for your seat, your regular seat, and teacher meets you at the door and says, "You can't sit there." She points me to sit in the back with 5 or 6 other Jewish kids in the class, because this is when the anti-Semitic law started coming into effect. So this is so kids that you would be playing in the park every day, your friends, non-Jewish friends, no longer would even look at you, and you had to sit in the back of the room. So this was the first that I remember which could have been the first and second grade.
How did your mother and father, or anyone else close to you, help you through this trauma at the very beginning, this separation and identification?
I can't really remember what they did or how they tried to protect me or anything like that. But what I realize today, having been a father myself with young kids, how they must have felt when knowing that I would walk on the street and I can get jumped on by bullies and stuff like that. So I can imagine how what they had to go through. I don't know how I would have felt about that, but I always think about that. So I really don't know what they did the best they could. I assume they protected me the best way that they could.
Are there softer memories of the years that you spent in Prešov? Your home, for example, what would that have looked like to me?
My house was always was a happy house. As I told you before, my father was a music and opera fan. We used to have it was called the gramophone, and we always used to have all the music playing. And my mother used to have a lot of Yiddish records. There was always music in our house, and as I said, lots of people always coming in and interacting. And I was a kid. I had lots of toys and everything. I had everything that I really wanted, that I needed, as far as I can remember, as a kid of 7, 8 years old.
How do the changes going on, around you're young. What is it that you see? What is it that you hear?
Well, I'll tell you what started affecting my life. First, I mentioned to you I had to sit in the back row of my school. I couldn't go to my normal playground because there was a big sign saying no Jews allowed. Okay, I couldn't go to. My father used to take me to the movies. No, I couldn't. Jews could no longer go to the movies. We had no play. I couldn't go to my playground. The only playground that I could go to was the big courtyard in the synagogue. That's where we used to go. But getting there was a problem also. So a very favorite recollection is one of my friends had an older brother who had 2 big German shepherds. And when we wanted to go to the courtyard, he would come and get a few of us together, and he would walk down the street with the German shepherds, and nobody could touch us. So these are the things as a kid that I remember.
Anything else?
That's I knew that I knew that being a Jew wasn't so great.
And what year is this starting to happen to you?
This started to happen in 41, 42, yes.
Were Jews compelled to identify themselves in any way as Jews?
Oh, of course, I forgot to tell you that after, I don't know at which point it came, you had to wear the yellow star. Anybody over, actually, I didn't have to wear it at the beginning because I think they said anybody over 8 years old had to wear a Jewish, the yellow star. So that's how you were a marked person when you walked out.
And where did you have to wear it?
on your outer clothing. You know.
Can you tell me, if your mother was a homemaker, I mean, as we would
Yes.
use it, okay. So she did the cooking, and she was the central figure in the house in preparing food, and
Absolutely.
okay. Did she have somebody else working with her that you remember?
I think we may have at one time we had I always call we had a maid. Okay. However, when these laws came to, they were no longer allowed to come to the house. But she really didn't. She managed very well without him.
I'd like to know your father. What was your father's occupation?
So my father was the representative of the largest paper factory in Slovakia. He had the entire eastern part of Slovakia was his territory, and he used to travel around, marketing product all over that part of the country. He had a huge warehouse in Prešov where all the papers and all the products were stored, and then from there they were shipped all over Slovakia.
What did the company have a name?
Yes, the company's name was Chemopap.
Can you spell that?
Chemopap. It was located in the center of the country. It was Jewishly, it was owned by Jewish owned. I remember we used to go there. I've been to the main factory with my father. I remember the people who the chiefs, the bosses, very nice people, and it was this company was known all over the country. That was one of the main suppliers of paper.
Excuse me. Was paper produced there?
It was produced, yes, in the main factory, right? Papers and cardboard. Cardboard.
So were there people there who went into the forest and felled the trees and made the pulp? And I mean, was there big machinery there?
Yes. There was the factory, right? The machinery, right? You're right.
Did your father, when he traveled, I'm assuming he traveled, did he bring things for you when he went out of the country?
How did you guess? So he would travel, but he usually was gone maybe at least two times a week. But every Friday before the Sabbath, I would get a toy, providing all based on my report card. My father expected me to be just number one. As a matter of fact, he used to carry my report card with his stuff to show off to his friends. And I was fortunate that I had good report cards because I had lots of toys. Every Friday.
I wanted to know if your father, in the course of traveling, for his business, brought things, from other places for you that couldn't be bought.
Right. The other thing that he used to bring home from his travels, whenever he hit certain towns or certain places, he would bring cheese or some sort of products or fruit from specialties places. I remember that also. So whenever he came home, it was always, I guess he thought of us because he always brought something.
Did he own a car?
No, nobody. There weren't too many cars. I didn't know they owned a car. No, The railroad and buses was the transportation.
Did you have a radio?
Yes, we did. We had a very, very good radio because one of the regulations that they put on Jews, they would put a certain seals on the radio that you could only listen to Slovak station. You couldn't. And what other station would you be interested in? BBC. To find out what's going on in the world, in the war. The war was raging, right? But so there was a man who knew how to unstrip the wire so that we could dial in the BBC. And I remember men used to come to my basement at night, and they would jiggle with the radio and listen to BBC.
I would have assumed that you would have had to have given up the radio entirely.
No, well, we had the radio.
So what you were supposed to listen to was Slovak nationalism.
Right. That's the only. If you wanted to listen, that's why we could listen to the state radio stations.
And what about Hitler?
Well, Hitler was on there too. Well, just so you know, Slovakia became a puppet fascist state. It was headed by a Catholic priest who was the president, and he was Hitler's ally. And besides Hitler's speeches, he used to make his own speeches, anti-Semitic speeches. So this we could listen to on the radio if we wanted to.
And what was his name? The priest's name?
The priest was Dr. Joseph Tiso, T-I-S-O. He was captured after the war. He was sentenced to death. He was hanged. However, they're rewriting history. When I made my trip back to Slovakia 50 years later, you can still find a few statues of him around the towns. And there was several years ago, there was a movement at the Vatican to make him into a saint, but there was so much pressure from the Jewish organizations that they scuttled it. Is there anything else that you can tell me in terms of the environment of your young years? We talked about schooling. What about vacations? There were after in 40, 41, 40, there were no vacations. First of all, Jews couldn't travel.
Before then.
Before
Do you have memory of that?
Yes, absolutely. As a matter of fact, so prior to all this stuff happening, vacations. Slovakia has two very famous towns. We call them spas. One is called Piešťany and one is called Varna. Every summer, my parents, we would spend 3-4 weeks there. They were taking the cure, the mud baths and all that stuff. And I remember one thing that I remember about that. And at night they used to have outdoor concerts. And one night I must have been probably about 5. I was there listening to the concert, and I was sort of wandered off. And there was a whole thing. They couldn't find me, and I was lost. But I came back. So I remember going to these every summer on this vacation.
Was it customary for you to go with your mother and father, or did other family members go with you?
We had lots of friends. There were lots of friends, and as a matter of fact, obviously there were kosher restaurants, because otherwise my parents wouldn't go. And it was a whole thing. It's very customary in Europe that you go to the spa or to the baths and you drink the spring water and all that stuff. And anybody could, all the Jewish people would do that practically.
Did you have a pet?
Absolutely not. Never had. It wasn't in style. I don't remember anybody having too many pets.
Is there anything else you want to tell me about, that time? Take a moment. I'm not in a hurry.
So, you want me to tell you about when they started deporting the Jews?
Well, if in your story that's where we are, but
right. I told you about all the laws, anti-Jewish laws that they put in.
You mentioned some.
Right. You couldn't go. Jews couldn't travel. They couldn't go to movies. They couldn't go to restaurants. They had to give an inventory of all their assets to the town. They wanted to know how much money you had and what everybody's state of wealth. And then, of course, came the registration. Every Jew had to be registered, so they wanted to know who's who. So this town, Prešov, was a town of about 20,000 people, and there were about 7,000-8,000 Jews. So they had a list of the Jews. And while in the other European countries, they started deporting the Jews. The Germans would occupy them. They started reporting the Jews. Not in Slovakia. Slovakia, they were going to take care of them themselves. They even made a deal with Eichmann that they would pay for every Jew that they would ship out. They would pay the Germans 5,000 crowns. In today's money, it's about $2,000. On one condition, that the Jews don't come back to claim their property. So what they did was the first people that they started taking were the single men and women, and they were taking them to labor camps in Germany. Okay, when the trains would come in into the middle of the town, it was a small town, like you had the main street, the cattle cars would come in. Everybody got obviously nervous. And at this time, this is my most closest call that I would say that I had during the war, was that what happened was that if they couldn't fill the trains, they went looking for more. They didn't want the trains to go empty-handed. And this one day, my father came running home and told my mother and me to get into bed. He heard that they were going up and down looking for women. They had to take women to fill the train. And I was to pretend that I was sick. And my mother was in bed with me. And sure enough, a guy comes, guys come up, and one guy comes upstairs to the bedroom, and he walks in and he sees me and my mother in bed, and he tells her, get up. He wanted her to get up and go. He wanted to take her. And my father kept, I still don't know how it really happened. He told the guy that I'm sick and she's taking care of me, that she has to, whatever, and by some sheer miracle, the guy looked around and did a turn and walked out. And that was sort of a close call. And so after they got through with, weeks later, after they got finished with taking the singles, the real job of taking families began.
Excuse me, you mentioned the name Eichmann.
Yeah.
Before, do you want to explain who that was?
Well, Adolf Eichmann was the chief architect of the what they call the final solution. He was the mastermind. He was the planner. He was the organizer in every country all over Europe. He was in charge of getting the people into concentration camps.
Deported.
Deported.
This is a big name, that you've learned about.
Yes.
Subsequently. But what about the local police? What?
The local police, or you could have been friends with the local police one day, and when the day comes when the things changed, they were all accomplices. They were fascists, and they were your enemy. The police, everything. They're the ones who rounded up the Jews to send them into camps.
So the people that you might have trusted before became complicit.
Absolutely.
Would you like to pause, take a sip of water? You've been speaking for a while. You mentioned things that the prohibitions against the Jewish community in terms of what they could and couldn't do. Excuse me. What about observance? Was the synagogue still open, or did you have to observe at home?
No, the synagogues were open, but you could be at the middle of the service. They could, rocks could come blasting through the windows or whatever, but the synagogues were open. Yes.
So, how was it that your family wasn't taken?
Okay, very good question. So, Slovakia was, unlike the Czech Republic, the Czech part of Czechoslovakia was the heavy industry, the universities and the scholars and all the businesses. Slovakia was basically a peasant country where most of the doctors were Jewish, the lawyers were Jewish, the businessmen were Jewish, the dentists were Jewish. They ran all the businesses. So the Slovaks, being in their planning, needed time to adjust. They weren't going to they still needed doctors, believe it or not, still needed stuff. So what they did was, when they first started deporting the Jews, they gave out exemptions. So to some of these people, saying that they're safe, they're not going to be taken, they're going to take the rest of the other people. So my father got an exemption because he was a businessman. I guess he was valued for his service. So the trains came in, they started loading the trains. But that did not give you a guarantee. Again, even you had an exemption, if you would be walking on the street with your exemption and they still needed to fill the trains, you were gone. So with that in mind, my father decided that while the trains were in town, while they were being loaded, they usually took them about 24 hours to load or whatever, one after another, we went into hiding in my father's warehouse, which up in the attic. I was 6 or 7 years old. My mother and my father up in the attic. During the day, the warehouse people were working in the warehouse. You couldn't make a sound. At night it was dark. You still had to be quiet. And one of my father's trustees, employees there, he would come in every night and bring us some water and some food. To this day, I cannot imagine how, knowing that I have my young grandchildren, how wild they are, they're running around, how my mother was able to keep me quiet for 7 weeks. We stayed there for 7 weeks. When there was a pause in the deportations, we came out. None of us could even speak because we were whispering for 7. If you don't speak loud for 7 weeks, you have no voice. We came out, continued. A few months later, they started again.
Excuse me for interrupting you. I need to hear more from you about living in hiding. And you're on the top of the warehouse. You're on a. There has to be an access to some portion of the warehouse.
Right, it's an attic.
It's an attic. Okay. Would things normally have been placed up there, or was it just empty?
I really.
Okay.
Probably not, because nobody came up there.
Did your father make preparations for you to be able to sleep up there? Was there mattresses? Was there straw?
Yeah, yes, there were. So obviously he must have done that.
And what time of the year was that?
It was summertime.
Okay. During the day, you couldn't talk. How did you take care of your bodily needs?
I tell you the truth, I don't remember. Obviously, we did. I don't remember.
But in addition to whispering or not speaking, what other precautions can you recall that were taken?
So what I used to do, I remember my mother used to read books, used to read to me. I remember that. And what I remember very specifically was when she was at night, when she was trying to get me to sleep, she kept telling me the stories of her home, which was in a small village where she grew up, about their chickens and about their roosters and about everything that they did over and over again. Every night the same story. And what's ironic was that 50 years later, when I finally went to that village to visit the village, I actually saw that I was on the street where I didn't have the exact house, but I knew the street where she lived, and there were still roosters and chickens over there. So I remember her every night telling me all these stories till I fell asleep. That I remember as it was yesterday.
So there's a hero in this scenario. It's one of your father's employees. Yes. What was his name?
His name was Ivan Cigany.
Could you spell that?
Cigany.
And what was his relationship to your father?
He worked. He was his right hand man.
How is it that he was able to bring you nourishment?
Well, he was for him walking into the warehouse is normal. I mean, he was if anybody would have seen him walking in. That's his place, and especially he was not one of the anti-Semitic rules that they installed was that Jews could no longer own their businesses. They had to sign it over to an Aryan. So he was actually at that time he was the boss, not my father. He was the boss.
So he fulfilled the requirements, the political requirements,
yes.
But he also saved your life.
Yes, absolutely.
Just as an aside, was he ever recognized by Yad Vashem for this?
No. And what's ironic is that when I decided to go back to Slovakia with my kids, with my family, to show them. I never wanted to go. I never wanted to step foot in that country, but they kept bothering me, and then I realized that it's my duty to take them back there. So prior to going, I contacted City Hall of the town trying to get information of this man. Obviously, he would no longer be alive, but maybe his children, or certainly his grandchildren. It's not such a small town. It's a small town to find him, and I wanted to go there and tell him that their grandfather or their father saved my life. And as soon as I got City Hall, the first question that they asked me was whether I was a relative. I said, I'm not. So therefore, I can't give you any information. Case closed. I tried with other people from town. They said there's no way they would give you the information. Reason being, they were afraid that I was coming back to perhaps claim property 50 years later, which wasn't the case. So that is. I was very sorry about that. But to this day, in my calendar, in my notebook, I have his name pasted on top of one of the pages, and I never forget.
Isn't there a possibility of submitting the paperwork to Yad Vashem? Now, because you are the survivor.
Right. I thought about it, and I know many people. I spoke to people in Israel. First of all, to begin with, he only saved the three of us. No, I'm just saying, and most of the people who are honored in Yad Vashem did much more. Anyway, that's only subjective. However, the main part is that I have no paperwork or anything like that to substantiate it whatsoever. It's only my word. And the other thing is that usually the thing when you honor somebody, their families come there, and there's no traces of anything. So it's just really. Anyway, I rest my case. I have him over here.
I understand that. If you save one Jew, you save the world.
I know that. Very good.
Famous quote.
Yes.
But from what I understand, you would be the person to initiate.
Yes.
You know his name. You
Yes.
know what town he came from.
I know.
And I mean, maybe the Israelis take care of finding out the relatives that you could not get through to.
I know, but I think it's passé. I missed my chance a long time ago. I rest my case.
Maybe not.
Maybe
Hope
not.
is indefatigable.
Okay.
Because you clearly have an emotional attachment.
I'll tell you what to do. You met my son Stephen. He's the guy who to do it.
It would be an honor because this is a very clear story, and I think I feel it would bring you conclusion to something that happened to you as a child.
Right.
So why don't we take a 5-minute break and resume the story?
Perfect.
This is the continuation of my interview with Fred Schoenfeld. During the break, I asked you the question about the Star of David and having to wear, you have memory of Jews having to wear that. That was all Jews, men and women?
Yes.
And children of a certain age?
I believe it was anybody over the age of 8 or 9.
And what about, in addition to the yellow Star of David, which was worn on the chest, what other indications were there?
Well, as I said, my father was in business and he had to travel, and for some reason he didn't have to wear a big yellow star. he just had a sort of like a plastic small little star. It was like a pin. It was pinned on like a, and I guess to make him special, something like that.
Well, it enabled him to move
Yeah,
maybe more freely.
Yeah. So that's and there also there was at one time people wore a yellow armband, but I don't know exactly where or when.
If you were looking up at the people that you loved and trusted, your mother and your father, what was the feeling for you as a child, seeing your parents being treated this way, being dehumanized?
I've been asked that question before, and I really don't know how to answer it. I was a young kid. I knew that there was danger out there, and I knew that people were concerned or whatever, but I didn't exactly know what was going on. I'll give you a better example. When before the deportations, it was a known fact that we were going to be deported. People were we were going to be resettled. It was the word, and people had suitcases ready to go. And for those of you who have ever been to Yad Vashem, and in one section on the exhibit in Yad Vashem is this whole room with all kinds of suitcases, room full of suitcases with people's names on it. Those were the same suitcases that I had in my house with the names, because we didn't know what's going to happen. And I remember that I was given a knapsack with all kinds of stuff for me, and I was even happy. I was glad to have the knapsack without even knowing what this was all about. But I remember those suitcases. And when I've been to Yad Vashem many times, but the first time I went to Yad Vashem, I went past the room with the shoes and with all that stuff. It was tough, but when I came to the room I was with my kids, and the piles of suitcases, brown, most of them were brown. So I froze in my tracks. As a matter of fact, I think at the museum downtown, I think there's a picture of that room with the suitcases too, I think. When I saw those suitcases, I froze, and I was terrible.
Could have been you.
Absolutely.
Before we took the break and had these subsequent discussions, I wanted to know as much as you could share with me about the pressure of being in hiding, which is more than the challenges of being in hiding. What about your father? You talked about your mother singing to you and telling you stories.
I tell you the truth, it's only what I can imagine. I mean, I really don't remember, but I can imagine what it was like. And as a matter of fact, my mother, she never, after the war, she carried this trauma with her the rest of her life, because not only what she was going through, let's say in the warehouse, she had her parents and her 4 brothers and 3 sisters were all over Europe. She didn't know whether they were for 3 years, 4 years. She didn't know whether they were alive, were they dead, where were they, how were they. So just that alone, plus what we were going through, it really had an effect. And she suffered from that till, she happened to live till 80, but she suffered through it all this time. And as for me, I was a kid. I don't remember.
And going back to the environment when you were in hiding. The employee came at night, and you said the first time, and then there was a second time of going into hiding for multiple weeks.
Same time. It's the same time.
What about cleanliness during that time?
I don't remember.
Did you go, well, did you pass all that, to save yourself, did you have to pass multiple weeks without bathing?
You want to know something? I wondered about that. I have no idea. I have no idea. I wish I could tell you, but I don't know. I assume there must have been something. Listen, my father was my parents were as neat as you could, so there must have been something. I can only assume that at night, this was a warehouse. There had to be facilities, people, right? So I assume, that's what I assume.
You mentioned that there was a lot of whispering or silence. What other physical impact did you experience from having been motionless for weeks?
There was room there. I mean, I think it wasn't like very contained. There was a pretty big attic, I guess, so it wasn't so bad, I don't think.
Were you weak? I mean, when you came down?
The only thing that I remember is not being able to speak. All the three of us.
So, the first time that you emerged from the warehouse, where did you go?
Back to our house. Everything was normal. As long as those trains weren't weren't at the station, everything was okay.
And then, what changed so that you had to go back into hiding?
Well, they resumed the deportations, and then they gave out exemptions, but to less people. They narrowed the field. And my father was again fortunate to be exempted again. But again, we went through the whole thing, till back into hiding for another 6-7 weeks, till they got finished with the deportations. When they got finished, by that time, they were convinced that most of the Jews were gone. They knew that some of them were obviously still around. So they decided that all the Jews from the eastern part of the country had to leave and move towards the middle of the country. There were some people who had other hiding places on farms or other places. They decided to go into hiding, and the rest of us, we moved. So we moved into middle of this country, and we rented a house at a farm. All throughout the area, there were farmhouses, and the remaining Jews would go and rent. They would rent a farm, the place to live, which the farmers were very happy to rent to us for money. So this would be June of 1944. So by June of 1944, the eastern part of Slovakia, according to them, was free of Jews, Judenrein. And all throughout the rest of the country, there were all over, there were Jews, 30 Jews, 50 Jews, or whatever. And that's where we lived.
Excuse me, but doesn't that mean that the farmers would have had to have been complicit?
No, they didn't have. Nobody was touching us. They didn't have to do anything. Eventually, when they decided, the program was that eventually they're going to round up everybody, right? But for the time being, everything was okay. And at the same time,
what year are we talking about?
1944. Okay. that's already most of the with the exception of the Hungarian Jews, most of the European Jewry was already gone. Okay, so in the meantime, the war was coming to an end. From the east, the Russians; from the west, the Americans. So there was an uprising in Slovakia, the Slovakian uprising, because they created to make it faster. You know, they had an uprising in the middle of the country. A lot of Russian paratroopers arrived, and they had an army of about 10,000, and they were going to start fighting the Germans. They were blowing up the trains, and they were blowing up whatever. So it was great, right? But in the meantime, the Germans finally decided that they had enough, and they brought in thousands and thousands of troops, and they broke up the uprising. So the Slovaks, members of the Slovak uprising, they went back to their houses, but the Russians had no place to go. So they went up into the mountains, the Tatra Mountains, nearby, and then up to now, I told you that the Germans did not go after the Jews, but once they were here, every day they would go looking for the Jews. So we moved up. We knew we couldn't stay in the village anymore, so we moved up to the mountains. They had some hunting lodges, and we went up to the mountains. When I said we, there were about 40 of us in this place, all over the place. Okay, and each and we stayed with the partisans. The partisans were all over the place. They were roaming around. At night, they used to go blow up the trains and fight the Germans. And during the day, they were with us. They were up in the mountains. And each day, the Germans would go up to the mountains and never got to us. Maybe 5 miles next to us was another group of Jews. They got them, and so this was now November, December, 1944. Sometimes we had stuff to eat. Sometimes we didn't have food to eat. The war was coming to an end. Snow was about this high. We could hear planes flying overhead, going to war. We could hear the bombardments of the artillery coming, and the Germans were down in the valley. We were up, and now I'm going to describe my most critical day, and I remember it as if it was yesterday. Now we're into February of 1945. Late in the afternoon, we see a commotion. we see soldiers coming up the hill. Everybody got scared. We didn't know what was going on. It was this Russian army and including members of the Czech Free Army coming up the hill. It came right to our cabin. They were going around the bend. They were going to attack the Germans from the back because they were dug in there. They're trying to move the front. They told us, and then the most incredible thing, there I was, 1945, I was almost 9 years old, this big, huge soldier with a machine gun, and he spoke Yiddish. It was one of the Czech army, Free Army. There were a lot of Jewish soldiers with them, okay? They told us to stay still. They were going to, they're going to fight, the Germans, and the front will be move up, and we'll be okay. I remember they left us bread. I never forget that they left a few loaves of bread. The next morning, early in the morning, we wake up to tremendous gunfire, shots, cannons all over the place. The soldiers are coming back. They found out that the Germans were stuck in so deeply there that they thought they were going to be there for a long, they didn't know for how long this was going to be there. They said, these are the Jewish guys, you come with us. You can't stay here because who knows how long you're going to have to be here. We'll take you with us.
That's the entire group?
About 40 of us, yes. I was the second youngest. I remember, but the youngest one still lives. I see him. He lives in Brooklyn. They lined us up, single file, with spaces between us, and they gave us instructions. When you hear a whistling sound, you got to hit the ground because those are the bullets flying. So we started out early in the morning, and what we basically had to do, we had to cross the firing line into safety. What I remember, the beautiful white snow and bodies lying in the snow with the red blood, because that's where the fighting was going on. And we slowly made our way. Unfortunately, it was a grandmother, one of the ladies, she passed out. She had a heart attack in the middle of the trip. They left her there for the time being. And by nightfall, we had crossed the lines, and we were free. So that's the day it's another day that I will never forget. Remember crawling through the snow.
How do you make, I'm getting ahead of myself because I want very much to talk about the talks that you give to schools, as an educator, as a survivor, as an educator. How can you best convey that scenario to children today?
Well, it's very, very interesting. So I do talk to kids, and I speak at colleges, I speak at synagogues, but mainly in the schools, high schools and middle schools. But sometimes I've spoken to kids as young as the 5th and 6th grade, and I obviously don't give them the gruesome story. I sort of.
But to those who are old enough to hear this, how do you do it?
Just like I did now. I tell them the way it is, the way it was, the way I remember it, and they listen, and they take it in. But the reason I do all this stuff was, I'll tell you an interesting story. How I got into this whole thing. I never considered myself as a Holocaust survivor. Why? In my mind, to be a Holocaust survivor, you had to go to a concentration camp. That was my rationale. I didn't have a number. Many times I come to schools, they want to show me your number. Okay? So I never considered myself a Holocaust survivor. But my 2 sons kept bothering me. Says, you were in Europe during the Holocaust. You survived. Therefore, you're a survivor. And then when I saw all the stuff that was going on with the Holocaust deniers and with all the stuff that was going on, I decided that I am a Holocaust survivor, and it's my duty to tell the story as I lived it. And what I try to convey in schools, especially in public schools, that the Holocaust was not the first Holocaust in our history, in the history of the world. There was the Armenians and Rwanda and all that, and history. They have to remember this. Soon there will be no longer any survivors to tell the story, and it's up to them to remember and to tell the story and to make sure that it doesn't happen again, because history repeats itself, and that's what motivates me to talk to schools.
But can they grasp? That's the question.
Some
can they grasp what you suffered, even though
some,
not deported?
I want you to know that I have in my room piles of, afterwards they send me letters and stuff like that. That's incredible. Some of them do, some of them do, and some of them don't. Like I'll get a question, were you afraid? Or I get a question, do you hate the Germans? Or stuff like that. I get all kinds of interesting questions, but the older the kids, the better they get it. And what I am amazed, I never even knew, in New York State, it's the schools, it's in their curriculum to learn the Holocaust every year. And, in the springtime and during the Yom HaShoah, that's when I do all my speaking. And when I come to the schools, the classrooms are filled with maps, with all the stuff. I mean, I'm speaking to a school in the South Bronx, a tough school. I don't have to tell you about that. The kid raises his hand, says, "What did you think of the Nuremberg trials?" I'm amazed. He knows about the Nuremberg trials. So we are doing something good.
I'll get back to that at the tail end of the interview.
Okay.
We're not there yet.
Okay.
You've just been liberated. You're still in Europe. So where do you go? What do you do?
The next day, we spent the night with the army in the camp. The next day, we get onto an army truck, and he takes us back to Prešov, the town where we lived. Can't go to our house. Somebody else is living there. I don't know. So we must have gotten us some rooms, and that's where we were. Prešov at that time, looking for people, survivors, whatever. Another thing that I will never forget. Every afternoon, I remember going with my parents to the town square, where trucks would be coming into town, bringing in survivors. Some of them still in their, uniforms. People would go and looking every day looking for survivors. Some of them had happy reunions, and some of them left empty-handed. And slowly but surely, people started getting organized, and we had so after living there for a few weeks, Czechoslovakia became united again. So we moved back to my old town Košice, where we came from before, which was a much bigger town, and that town had was a center point where most of the survivors came, and lots of teenagers, orphans who survived. By that time, help was coming from the Hayas in the United States, and from Palestine they were sending in people to help organize. They were organizing all the young kids who had no parents, and in preparation for them to going to hopefully to the state of Israel. And my father, 6 weeks after the war, he was back in business.
For somebody who may see this interview who doesn't know what HIAS stands for.
Hebrew Immigrants Aid Society, which was a very, very prominent, still today, society which helped Jewish causes, Jewish immigrants, even before the war. And during the war, and of course after the war, they did a tremendous job relocating all the Holocaust survivors. Did I say it right?
So, what directions, were your family pulled in? Your mother, your father?
So, as I told you, my mother's family was all over Europe, okay, and slowly but surely she got in touch with them, Okay.
Excuse me, when did you find out that your grandparents didn't survive, that they were deported? How did you find that out?
Well, how did we find out? Well, where was he? I mean, we knew. We knew. I have a book. I knew exactly. I mean, we knew that he went to Auschwitz, and we knew that he didn't survive. And if he would have survived, he would have come back. So there was. So my father had two brothers and a sister in the United States. They left in the 1920s. So after the war, they got in touch. And my uncle, who lived at that time in Cleveland, immediately sent papers to my father, says, I'm sending you the affidavits, file the affidavits, and come to the United States. Now we're talking 1940, 45, 46, 47. Czechoslovakia became back to the old democratic country that it always was. My father said, why? I said, why should I go? I have my business here. Yes, we're reconstructing. People are getting organized. This is where I live. This is where I have everything that I want. And fortunately, my uncle in Cleveland kept bugging him, says, okay, just do me a favor, file the papers, okay? Which we did. And 47 was good. 48, everybody was, every married Jewish woman was pregnant because everything was coming back to normal. The synagogue was there. And all of a sudden, 1948, end of 47, there's a communist takeover, becoming a communist country. So the handwriting was on the wall. So all the Jews, they were just waiting for the state of Israel to be established, which would be in May of 1948. They were going to Israel, and we were going to the United States. All my friends, I remember this also. I was ashamed that I was going to the United States. All my friends were going to Israel. They already knew all the songs, everything. They were going to of course, the teenagers, they were going right from the boat. They were going into the army, but and I was ashamed to tell them that I was going I'm going the easy way, not to Israel. Anyway, so.
Well, excuse me, you mentioned that the teenagers knew the songs. Does that mean that there was any, between the end of the war and this period, that there was any preparation?
No, right after the war was over, we had emissaries from Palestine. They came to prepare, to help the people and to prepare. And we had summer camp.
Which was called what?
Machaneh, something, and we had Mizrahi and we had HaShomer HaTzair, the religious ones. I mean, Jewish life was coming into a thing, but the main idea was all these people to go to, which they did. And I came to the United States. So we left in June of 1948. And
How did you get here?
Queen Elizabeth I, the boat. Not on we had, we were rich. And I docked right here on the pier on 48th Street in New York City. June, as a matter of fact, August 4th, 1948, I arrived. And
what was that experience like? Was that the first time you ever you were on a boat?
Of course, we didn't have any boats in Czechoslovakia. And what I forgot to say, that we came in June, and the following November, the Iron Curtain fell. And that was it. So we were lucky again.
So, where did you go to live? Who took you in?
Well, at that time, as I mentioned, so my father had an uncle and an aunt living in Pittsburgh. So we decided to go. We went to Pittsburgh, and we were However, what happened was, unfortunately, right after we came there, but a year after, my father got sick, and he passed away. That in 1950. As a matter of fact, the Yahrzeit candle is for him. And he passed away August 6, 1950, 2 years and 2 days after we came to this country. So there was my mother, my 4-year-old sister. My mother didn't speak English or anything like that. Can you imagine the trauma? But she also had a sister living in New York. Her sister and her husband, my uncle, they brought us to New York and set us up in an apartment. They supported us. I was in high school, and since then I lived in New York.
Oh, and when was your sister born?
1946, year after the war.
And her name?
Sylvia.
What feelings, what memories do you have about Israel becoming a state? Where were you when that took place?
I was still in Czechoslovakia.
Israel.
Well, Israel is. What can I tell you about Israel? I was very fortunate because I was in the diamond business, and I did business in Israel. So for about 30 years, I would be in Israel at least 4 times a year. So it became my. I was lucky that I could do it, that I've traveled. I've got friends and relatives all over the place, but to me, that's it's incredible. I was also involved in the Maccabee Games, so that was my involvement. I'm still involved with the Elan Center, Sports Center for the Disabled. I'm involved with the International Jewish Hall of Fame, and my sons, who I took to Israel many, many times. They also went on birthright, and I don't have to. I passed on my message, and so Israel is, it's. What can I say about Israel?
You talked about the challenge to your mother, who was not English speaking, coming here and having the two of you, right?
Right.
How did you adapt? You were a teenager.
I was in high school.
Yeah.
I had my own. I was in my own world. I adapted. I had a great time in high school.
When you came, did your family join a synagogue or become part of the Jewish community where they were living?
You mean
how did that happen?
My mother?
Well, yes, your mother and then
yeah, of course, yes. We belong to synagogue here on 90.
You couldn't do it during the war, so now.
Oh yeah, of course.
So
my mother was religious. She stayed religious. I'm the one who strayed. Had my father been alive, I don't know. I would have taken a different road, I'm sure.
Did you ever have a bar mitzvah?
Of course, in Pittsburgh, my father was still alive.
So, how old were you when you had that?
I was 13, 1949.
Okay.
I had a bar mitzvah.
Right on time.
Right on time, but I did not have a bar mitzvah as we know it today.
What was it? What was it like?
Well, I'll tell you. About 6 weeks before my bar mitzvah, my father, after dinner, says, "Sit down. I'm going to teach you the Haftorah." Right? And he taught me. It was a small synagogue. I did my stuff. We had a small kiddush downstairs, and that was it. I mean, originally that's how it used to be anyway.
Just last week, I think, it was last week, since we are talking about Pittsburgh. What was your reaction to the verdict about the verdict in Pittsburgh about the Tree of Life shooting?
Well, first of all, I want you to know that when we lived in Pittsburgh for 2 years, I didn't belong to that synagogue in Squirrel Hill. Squirrel Hill was the part of town where the rich Jews lived, and I lived in the other side of the town. But I know exactly I know the building, so I don't have to tell you how my feelings when it happened. As far as the verdict, I fully agree with the verdict. For one reason, that perhaps it may deter somebody else from doing the same thing again.
There is a very good book called Squirrel Hill.
I read it.
So did I.
I read
For
it.
a different reason.
And I ate in the deli many times. I still have friends in Pittsburgh. I go. My father is buried in Pittsburgh, so I usually go every second or third year. I go to the cemetery. So I still have my friends there.
I would have approached the subject a little bit further and later on, but since you spoke about Pittsburgh, I thought it was the right time to bring it up. So you had your bar mitzvah, but then you came to New York?
Right.
Okay. And where did you live in New York?
57 West 93rd Street, between Columbus and Central Park.
And what schooling were you having at that time?
I went to the High School of Commerce, which used to be where Juilliard is today.
And excuse me, what was that like? High School of Commerce.
It was great. Listen, I was new. I started there sophomore year. Freshman year I did in Pittsburgh. I was a member of the soccer team, so I was could walk around with a chip on my shoulder, and I was a typical teenager. What can I tell you?
Was your mother more, I use the word assimilated, when she came to New York? Had she?
Well, most of her friends were at that time also survivors that she knew, and many of them at that time lived in the city that she knew, and she was fine.
So in that neighborhood on West 93rd Street, was there a survivor community?
Not really organized, but there were lots of European people, whether survivors or not. A lot of Belgian people living on West End Avenue that she knew. She had many friends, yes.
And by that time, had your father passed away?
Yeah, my father passed away in Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh. What responsibilities did you have, if any, to help her?
Well, when I used to, well, first of all, my aunt and my uncle supported us for the beginning. They brought us in, the furnished apartment and everything.
Excuse me, what were their names?
Wolf and Esther Kleinhaus. And so I worked after school. I delivered groceries for the supermarkets right here on the West Side. So what happened was the way I got the job was very interesting because when I first moved into New York, I was still saying Kaddish for my father. And I used to go to a small synagogue on 91st Street and got friendly, with all the people. There I was, a teenager. I was 14. I didn't miss a single day. So one gentleman says, "You want to make some money? You know about me." So I said, "Yeah." So I said, "Would you like to deliver groceries?" He says, "Yes." But you needed, I think you needed to be 16 to get working papers or something like that, or 15. I wasn't eligible. So he fixed it up that I could work there. And unfortunately, after about 3 months, I had to stop because the shopkeeper was afraid that he was going to get into trouble. So that was my first job.
And how did you? So that's the High School of Commerce. So you graduated from that, and
Yes.
then.
So what I wanted to do is I wanted to be a CPA. First, I wanted to be a sports writer, but I knew I couldn't afford to work for 5 years for low wages. So I decided I wanted to be a CPA, and I was very good at it. I had passion for it, and I was going to go to Baruch College at night because I had a job lined up at a accounting office during the day, and go to school at night. And but the summer after my graduation, my uncle was in the diamond business. My uncle who brought us to New York, and he was going to Europe on business. He wanted me to help out in his office for the summer. And I said, okay, but it's my watch, sorry. And I said, okay, I'll work for you in the summertime, but I have a job in September. I was starting my job with the accounting firm. I said, okay. So I worked in the summer. What did I do there? I was a gopher. I went to the post office, got lunch. When the summer was over, he came back and he said, I hear that you're doing a tremendous job. And I said, what did I do? No, I want you to stay. I said, listen, we made a deal. I have a job waiting for me. And he was a very cute guy. He says, how much are they going to pay you? This is September 1953. And very proudly, I told him $40, which is whatever. $40. He says, I'll give you 50 to stay. Do you understand what it meant, the difference between $40 and $50 to a kid, 18-year-old kid? So I said, all right, a few weeks. Anyway, to make the story short, in a few weeks he raised it to 60, and I wound up being in the diamond business for the rest of for the next 60 years. And so, and of course, then I was able to support my mother and all that stuff.
What does it mean to be in the diamond business?
Well, in this business was that at that time, my uncle and his two brothers, they had a diamond cutting factory in Antwerp, in Belgium. They would import, they would cut the stones in Belgium, later on in Israel. They would cut the diamonds, bring them here, small diamonds, and we would sell them to jewelers and to jewelry manufacturers. And that's how later on, when the business shifted to Israel, I would be going on buying trips to Israel, 4 or 5 times a year.
Did you mention the name of the company? I'm sorry, I don't remember.
Well,
what was the name of the company?
The original company was Kleinhaus Brothers.
Right.
Then it became Kleinhaus and Schoenfeld after my uncle passed away and I took over the business.
What do you remember about the next pivotal event in Israel before the war in 73. What do you remember about the Eichmann trial?
I remember during the Eichmann trial, it must have been
61.
61. So obviously I remember the Eichmann trial. I didn't follow it too closely. I was too busy, raising a family and doing the thing. But since then I've done a lot of reading and all the stuff that's available and all the background and everything. So what can I say about this? Justice was done to him. Not enough justice was done. To the rest of them, which reminds me, one of the questions when I was telling you, Kit asked me, "What did you think of the Nuremberg trials?" Was one of the questions, and something came over me. So I said, "I think not." I said not enough of them were put to death. I mean, it was a little bit out of line. Says if it were me, I would have taken them all against the wall and against the wall and shot them. I was later on. I apologized to the teachers because it wasn't the proper place and way to do it. But to answer your question now, not enough was done. Not only in Nuremberg, but all over the places. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of Nazis who got away with it.
You mentioned raising a family.
Yes.
When did you get married? Yes.
September 1959.
And were children born of this marriage?
Yes. Stephen, you met, born in 1962, and my son Bruce, 1966.
How did your life during the war impact your marriage?
I don't see.
It didn't?
I don't see how it's, not that I...
And when you had sons?
What about it?
How did it have an impact on the way you raised them?
It wouldn't have mattered whether they would be sons or daughters. One thing, the way I raised them was I wanted to make sure that they got a Jewish education to begin with, and we moved to the island, and I made sure that they went to a Jewish day school, the Brandeis School. My wife didn't want them to go there, but it was one thing that I would not budge on, and they went to Brandeis. They hated, usually they hated because they had to stay in school much later than all their friends outside. But you ask them today, they'll tell you they thank me for sending them there. And I can tell you that they're proud Jews. They wear it on their sleeves. They're involved in Jewish organizations. They've been to Israel. They speak Hebrew, and that's my that's what I wanted to do, and that's what I hope many other people do the same thing.
Without the interruptions that you had.
Yes. Yes.
You spoke about going back, and about going back to Slovakia.
Yes.
Can you talk more about that?
Well, as I said, I made up my mind that I would take him. My kids wanted to spend a week more to vacation. I said I would not do that. I figured out that it would take me about 4.5 days to take him every place that they can retrace my history. And
excuse me, what was their motivation in asking you?
The motivation was because they knew unlike, as you well know, many Holocaust survivors claim clammed up about their experience for various valid reasons. We all know that. I and my family, I told them everything. Not only that, but when I told you I have aunts and uncles, family in Belgium and in England, and they know them too. So they met them, and every place they learned something about the history of my family in Europe. So they knew all about it, and so I said I owe it to them. So then, if I have the opportunity to take them to the town where I lived, to show them the synagogue where I went to show them that the town where their great grandfather lived, that it would be a good thing to do. So that was my motivation.
Did you have experiences when you returned that you didn't anticipate?
I probably anticipated. I was hoping wouldn't happen. I will, if I may, I will tell you 3 examples. The first one was I went to the house where I lived. In those days, there were no iPhones. My kids had these video cameras, and wherever they went like this. And I pulled up in front of my house on the balcony, and they were taking pictures. I showed them where I lived. A guy comes out on the terrace, looks at me, and he says, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I lived in this house 50 years ago, and my kids are taking the pictures." He looked at me and he says, "Okay, take the pictures and get the hell out of here," except he used a different word, okay? That was experience number 1. Experience number 2, we went to my grandfather's and my father's synagogue in Bardejov. The day we were there, there was only one Jew left in town who took care of the cemetery and the synagogue. I had made an appointment with him from the States that I was coming. The day we were there, they were whitewashing swastikas from the synagogue. Okay? That's what I found. Of course, we went into the synagogue. I saw my grandfather's name there and everything. It was great. And then finally went to my grandmother's farm, small town where they lived. I told you my mother used to tell me the stories about the chickens and the roosters. I have never been to this village in my life. All I knew is stories. But before going there, my mother's sister, she was still alive, lived in Israel. I called her up and I told her, "I'm going to finally to see your town. How will I find your house?" Very simple. You come to town, you go to the railroad station, you'll see a wooden bridge. You cross the bridge and you make a right turn on the first street. You'll see a beautiful wooden house. That's our house. We do it. We drive into town, the railroad station. I'm looking for the wooden bridge. The wooden bridge is no longer there. It's a steel bridge. It's 50 years later. Go over the steel bridge. We go to the houses. We see the house. A lady asked me, "Can I help you?" I said, "I'm looking for my grandparents used to live here many, many years ago." So she says, "You're looking for the Jewish houses?" I said, "Yes." She was very nice. I said, "Well, I think this is where they used this was a Jewish street." She sent for this old lady who probably knew it. The old lady comes with a cane. I asked her the same question, and she says, "Are you looking?" Says, "This house, that's where the Jews used to pray." So it made sense to me because my mother, it was such a small village, there was no synagogue. And on holidays, my grandfather used to conduct service in his house. So there was the house. So while this was going on, a guy comes running across the street yelling wildly, obviously speaking in Slovak, "Are the Jews here to take the houses back?" Okay? I told him, "Don't worry, I'm not taking your house back." So these are the 3 examples of what I found. I anticipated it, and that's why nothing has changed, and that's why we have to. I will never go. my son Stephen that you met, he already has plans of taking his granddaughter, obviously a few years later, because he would like her to have the same experience. And I said, and he said, will you, like he said, no, we'll all go. I said, Stephen, you go with all my blessings. I will never step foot there anymore. However, it's okay for them to do it. So all in all, I think I did the right thing.
What about Poland?
I have no reason to. No, I'm not going to travel now. I never had any personal. Many times I was going to go on the walk that they have with one of my kids, the march when my kids were still in high school. I could never find the time. Okay, but I have no personal relations to Poland. Now, for instance, to give you an example about my kids, my son Bruce went to Poland with the Stephen Wise Temple to deliver help to the Ukrainian border. So we've got it covered.
I see that you're a reader.
Yes.
We've discussed several titles. So is it intellectual, or do you still want to know why?
My reading is, first of all, it's 99% nonfiction. Obviously, I read a lot of books about Judaism and Jewish history, because I really did not have a full Jewish education. I just didn't. So that's number one. Number two, I'm very interested in all the politics in Israel, which is current. And the other thing is that I'm interested in history, and a lot of European history, where you see books about World War II, and I'm trying to relate to all the stuff that was going on while I was a kid, and starting to make sense. Books about how Slovakia went from democracy, to fascism, and all this stuff. And so, and the other thing that I do a lot of reading is some of the experiences of survivors, their life, how they survived. I have a friend who survived also in the woods not too far from me. He lives in Denver now. I was hiding in a hunter's lodge. He was hiding in a cave for I don't know how many months with his parents. He wrote a book. I like to read books like that. And of course, politics.
What about film? Do you see films?
Oh, I see all of the films. All the films, yes. And there's so many good ones, so many unbelievable ones. And I try to. There's always something, and I'm still trying to figure out. Right at the moment, my biggest concern is obviously, besides we all worry about anti-Semitism, because everything that's happening, and even in our politics, history repeating itself. But what's happening in Israel is I cannot get my hands around it. I just cannot conceive it, that this is what's happening, and how it's happening, and who's doing it, and it's unbelievable. And it's just frustrating to me.
Before we end the interview, since Stephen will be coming afterwards, is there something?
Yeah.
And he didn't have a chance to speak before we started the interview. Is there Anything you'd like to say to your children and grandchildren through this lens?
It's not. It's not only to my children or to my grandchildren. It's to all the kids that I speak to in schools. It's all the people that I ever speak to. It's not about me. It's not about me surviving. Obviously, I tell them how it happened just to give it some body. It's for them to learn about the Holocaust. And as I said, not only Holocaust. Besides, it wasn't only the Jews. Yes, there were 6 million Jews. There were gays. There were disabled people who were murdered. Not only to remember the Holocaust, but to study the causes, how it happened, because history repeats itself. Look what's happening in our great country. Look what's happening, and to keep this in mind, and to be good citizens, and to always not to be silent, and to do everything that they possibly can to help that this thing doesn't happen again. That's what I would tell my kids, my grandchildren, and anybody else that would listen to me.
Apparently, many have. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, I think we've covered. I think we've covered everything. I mean, I could tell you, write a book like this about people that I know, my family, and some of my family, aunts and uncles, the way they survived the Holocaust. In Switzerland, in Portugal, in Palestine, in England, in Holland, I could write a book about each one of them, that's it, you know.
Well, then I'd like to say thank you very much for your time.
I thank you.
And we will take a break, and then we will film the artifacts that you have.
Okay, can I call?
What? Wait.
Oh, sorry.
This is the continuation of my interview with Mr. Fred Schoenfeld. And before we do the artifact section, we have been joined by his eldest son, Stephen, who has returned to the filming so that he can answer some of my questions and participate in this interview. So good afternoon. Thank you for coming across town so quickly.
My pleasure.
Can you please explain to me how you either heard about your father's wartime experiences and when you heard them and how you absorbed them and what the impact was on you?
So from almost the age that I would understand family stories, and we'd meet lots of relatives who would visit from Europe or visit from other parts of the US. It was always in the dialogue that uncle, whomever, survived the Holocaust. So the word wasn't taboo growing up. I can't remember exactly when my father told me the first parts of his story, but I know that somewhere, either my father or my grandmother, his mom, shared some of the story that they were in hiding during the war and came to the US only after the war. So I was quite aware of that. I went to Jewish day school, and so somewhere second, third, fourth grade, we were probably first taught about something about the Holocaust. And in February of 1974, my father and mother took my brother and I on our first trip to Israel. So I would have been 11 years old. And we visited some relatives that had survived, not just survived the Holocaust, but I remember visiting one relative whose husband had actually been tortured, either by Dr. Mengele or another experimental doctor. And I'm pretty sure we even visited Yad Vashem. So certainly by the time I was 11, 12, and certainly by bar mitzvah age, I was aware that my father's family had been in Europe during the war, that many relatives had not survived. I knew what the Holocaust was. And I also knew on my mother's side, almost similar stories of some relatives surviving, some getting out before the war, after the war. That was a big demarcation. And I was therefore aware, being inquisitive. I would often ask my dad stories. We had an uncle, this was my dad's uncle, who had fought for the British. He got out before the war and then fought for the British. I remember my brother and I asking him questions. And I don't remember when we first visited Belgium. We probably late 70s, and then we asked some of the relatives there. It was never hidden from us. And my father, to his credit, was never editing his story. As we grew older, we became more aware. And speaking for myself, but my brother was also a student of history at university. A lot of our interest in history and international relations was because we knew how world events affected our family. So I was always interested, followed my own kind of course of investigation. And as I learned more, would often go back to my dad and ask, fill in the gap here or there.
So was the impact kinder because there was conversation about it? Was there anything that that ended up being traumatic for you?
Trauma is not the first or second or even third emotion that comes up for me. I think a sadness and an awareness that so much of our family didn't survive, but also an awareness that obviously if my father had not survived, we wouldn't have been around. So it was an appreciation of both the history and the whims of history that, as my father would say, some families had more resources or were better connected. Clearly, my grandfather, who I never knew, was smart and shrewd and was able to keep them one step ahead or away. But any one item, a few millimeters here, a few seconds there, a few bad luck instances, the officer who came into their apartment when they were hiding could have been in a worse mood. Any minor thing could have had a very, very different story. So I think it was a combination of sadness, anger at the Nazis and at what the Holocaust was, but not a personal sense of trauma. And clearly my dad seemed and was fine and was a great father, so I didn't feel like I was impacted in that way. But we were never sheltered from it.
Have you carried your early understanding and to inquiry and reading and seeing films about the war?
Without a doubt. again, you'll hear me say both my brother and I, because we both have this interest. Combined, we probably haven't read as many books about that era as our father, but we've read many, many books, seen probably all the major films that have the Holocaust as a theme or a sub-theme. We're also both very, very interested in World War II history, military history. I have a particular interest in the history of Israel's battles for survival. My brother has a lot of interest in British history, but it all is permeated by the period which was critical in my dad surviving the formation of the State of Israel. He came to the US, and as if that was not enough, Dayenu, we kept staying interested. So the first chance that my brother got to go to Slovakia, it was still Czechoslovakia. He was studying in Europe, and he went and visited the hometown of my father. The first chance I got to visit the former Soviet Union, I went, even though my dad wasn't thrilled. But it was about understanding that world. And starting around 1995, a few years after the Iron Curtain fell and the Soviet Union fell, I started asking my dad, when are we going to go visit? And my dad wasn't particularly interested to visit Slovakia. Clearly, this was traumatic to him, and there was a lot of hatred toward those who did all this to our family. Luckily, I was persistent, and by 98, my father gave us 4.5 days, 100 hours, that we can go to Slovakia. And so my brother and I organized a trip. We rented a minivan, and that visit was very powerful for us, for our late stepmom, and particularly for my dad. Not just seeing where we were, seeing my dad Slovak come back like that after 50 years of not speaking about it, seeing the places that we've heard, and the conversations we had at night, at dinner, in the morning, including very powerful conversations about what it means to be a survivor.
Why do you think he waited so long to do this interview?
To do this interview?
Yes, to do an interview with the USC, because it's been going on since the 90s, late 90s.
Well, in the late 90s, my understanding is supply outstripped demand. That I could be wrong on that, but certainly in the mid-90s, my father, if you asked him, he would have very likely had said, I'm not a survivor. I wasn't in the camp. Let them interview someone who was in the camp or who had it worse. The trip to Slovakia in 98, where we saw how close my dad came to, and the family came to, at minimum, being rounded up and deported, probably killed, but also his own realization and some good conversations. The Holocaust was Hitler's effort to destroy the Jews of Europe. My father was a Jew in Europe. He was not destroyed, therefore he's a survivor. And that sounds so basic, but in the hierarchy of survivors, my dad didn't feel like he had it so bad because he was a kid. First time he saw the planes, the Nazi planes flying over his hometown, he was excited. It's cool, there's planes. The same way I would be excited if I was 5 or 6. It took quite a lot of thinking and reflecting, and even just visuals. After we visited Slovakia, we visited Theresienstadt outside of Prague, and they have a whole tunnel filled with luggage that had family names and addresses. And right at that moment, my dad remembered that his mother had a bag like that the whole time. These kind of things bring it back into focus. But then it was my understanding that the Shoah Project had reached its goal, actually exceeded it, and was no longer filming. Completely unrelated, my father was connected through facing history and ourselves, and started speaking at elementary schools and middle schools and high schools. And this started more than 10 years ago. And it's become a very important part of my dad's life. He speaks to Jewish schools, non-Jewish schools, public schools, private schools, occasionally universities. A very powerful coming full circle moment for, I think, for both my dad and I, but certainly for myself, was when he and I traveled up to Worcester, Massachusetts, and he spoke to students and scholars at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which was established at Clark University, that my brother and I have both supported. And here was my dad lecturing to new scholars about his experience. My favorite history professor was in the audience and heard my dad's story for the first time. And he said to me afterwards, now I understand why you and your brother were so interested in history. And so it's really powerful and really a great thing that now he's able to speak to the Shoah Project. It's very possible in the mid 90s, it would have been a different type of conversation.
Sitting here thinking, I just realized Fred, your sister was born after the war.
Yes.
So how does she, I'm sorry I didn't ask that of you before, if I can ask now.
Well, as Stephen had explained, we never, our family, we always talked about it. It was nothing new to her. She knew generally, but she's been coming to some of my speeches when I speak in school, and every time she tells me she heard something that she never knew.
Yeah.
But she knew about the Holocaust because it wasn't a closed issue, she's aware of everything more or less. She don't forget a lot of things. She was 4 years old when when my father passed away. So a lot of things are blanks that she's filling in now. For instance, when I mention something that my father did or didn't do or whatever, which she didn't know, so she's very anxious to find it out.
Stephen, I asked your father at the end of the interview, if he wanted to make a statement to his kids and grandkids, which he did. Is there something you want to say to him about his doing this day, which is different, I guess, from the speaking in schools?
So there's a lot I'd like to say. So to me, I even used this word a few days ago. I said, this is in many ways a capstone of the journey that you've been taking, not just the journey we took 25 years ago, 1998 to Slovakia, but the one you started 10 years ago when you started speaking at schools. Now you have grandchildren who some understand what this is. My daughter is not yet fully understanding. And so you're sharing this knowledge in a way that will perpetuate your experience, not just for our family, but for the thousands of people who will be able to access the Shoah archives. And we are still learning. Bruce and I are still filling in gaps. I still learn tidbits every time you speak at schools. It was only less than a year ago that I found out that you carry the name of the man who brought you water and bread up in the attic. And so this is like a capstone course in graduate school. This is a milestone, but it's not the end. This story is going to continue to flourish. And I look forward to you being able to even watch this with Sarah, your granddaughter, and we'll take her questions.
Do you think that your father is a living example of Holocaust education? Do you think that we've been effective enough?
Well, there's a we and there's a he. So my father, to me and to those who know him and love him, is a living example of taking his experiences and what he learned about the importance of Jewish preservation from the Holocaust, and that determination that there never again be such dire threats to the Jewish people. He took it in many directions. The Holocaust education is just one piece of it. It actually started with insistence that my brother and I get a Jewish education, which we weren't always thrilled about, but now we appreciate. It's also about taking us to Israel very early, so we understood how important it's been. And I know my dad has seen how active I have been in pro-Israel policy and politics, and even his business in Israel. And his involvement in youth sport, Jewish youth sports, the Maccabee movement, and his passion for that. That takes Jews who are quite assimilated in the United States and brings them a connection to Israel, the same way Birthright does. All of those are reflection of his, I'd say, conscious and subconscious reaction to what he experienced. And every one of my friends and family who meet him, who learn about his background, they are in awe and love him for that. So what more can I say? This is just one piece, and we look forward to many more years of his sharing his love for the Jewish people and for Israel and the importance of survival.
Fred, let me just ask you one more question, and then we'll start to film your artifacts and the photographs. Do we have a chance at pushing back against virulent anti-Semitism as long as we have the internet? I mean, you're out there one-on-one with groups of young people whom you're trying to impact, and that you can make an impression and they'll remember you. But there is the internet, which is a full-blown assault on memory and truth. Who's going to win?
Well, you can't give up. You have to do the best that you can and fight back in whatever ways that you can. I'm not a techie, but we can use the internet to fight them off also. And that's by quitting and not doing anything, you certainly lose. So in order to be able to look at yourself in the mirror, you got to keep doing everything that you can in whatever way you can.
Okay, Stephen, thank you. I invite you to stay for this last part of the interview where your father describes the artifacts that we've assembled that support his story, as it were, including that fountain pen that we found out.
By the way, so
what?
He supports my story so far, right?
Yes, including not liking Hebrew day school.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh.
He did say that.
I was very subtle.
But I also told you that today he thanks me for it.
I do.
Yes.
I do. I appreciate what I learned. All right.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
So just pause. We'll turn off the camera,
Yeah.
and then you can watch this last process if you want to stay.
Okay. Well, I may go in the back room and eat my lunch.
We don't want you to pass out. So
Yeah.
we'll
see if it arrived without a knock.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's a picture of my parents, Eleanor and Simon Schoenfeld. That picture must have been taken in 1933 or 34. That's when they were married, and in Slovakia. So this picture is a picture of my grandfather, Laser Schoenfeld. It was taken, I would say, in 1941. I'm there next to him. My grandfather lived not too far from our house, and in 1942, for Passover, we made a trip to his town to be with him during the Seder. We had to do it at night because there was a curfew. Jews could not go out at night, especially on holidays. So we made it to his house. We had the Seder there. And that was the last time I saw him because about 3 months later, he was put on a train and taken to Auschwitz, where he perished. So this is a document which was written in 1941. At the time, it was called, one of the anti-Jewish edicts was that Jews could no longer own their businesses. They had to sign it over to a non-Jew. In this case, this paper states that a certain person, Ivan Sagani, was now the owner of the business that my father was associated. And there was proof. This was the official paper, and my father was no longer the boss. This man, Ivan Sagani, was a trusted employee of my father, because later on in the coming year, when we used to hide in the warehouse, he used to come and bring us food, water, and food every night. And without him and his help, I probably would not be sitting here talking about it. 50 years later, when I went back to Slovakia, and I was looking for ways of reaching his family, he no longer would be alive, but I thought maybe his children or his grandchildren would be there, and I would be able to see them and tell them and thank them for their grandfather saving my life. However, it wasn't meant to be, because City Hall would not release any information about this family, because they thought that I would be coming back to claim old property. But to this day, I remember this person, and in my daily daybook, I have his name pasted on one of the pages, and I will never forget him. Okay. So this is my father's fancy fountain pen. In those days, every gentleman had one, took care of it. It was a prized possession. What's amazing about this pen, that I remember my father carrying it with him all the time, not only during the good times, but even during the war, he always had that pen with him. And so this pen is probably 100 years old, and it's a treasure in our family. So in 1942, before we had to leave our town, my father went into our backyard and he buried all our religious objects, like candlesticks, the menorahs, and the Kiddush cup. And right there was, and after the war, when we came back, we couldn't go back to our apartment to live, but he did go into the backyard and shovel in hand, and he knew exactly where he had buried these things, and we salvaged everything that was there, the menorah, candlesticks, and what you see there is the Kiddush cup. If you look closely, it even has a dent when it was being dug out. Since that time, this is a very, very cherished object in my family. It goes to weddings, brises, and seders, and it's a real relic, and our family cherishes it very, very much.
What happened to the other artifacts?
Oh, my sister has them. She uses them. I don't like candles. This picture of my family was taken in July of 1948. We had just left Czechoslovakia on our way to the United States. We stopped off in Belgium, where we visited with my other grandmother and some other family members, including in that picture, you can see my sister Sylvia, who was exactly 2 years old at the time. And there we are, happy family, looking forward to our voyage to the United States and starting a new life. So this is a picture with my late wife Marlene, and this is our wedding day on December 24th, 1984.
And where were you married?
Hewlett, Long Island. So there's a family picture. I'm there with my son Stephen, my son Bruce, and my granddaughter Sarah, taken last year in New York.
Excuse me, where is Stephen and where is Bruce in this photograph?
Okay, Stephen is on the right-hand side and Bruce is on the left-hand side.